Westbridge, every notification carries a story. A simple message can change a life. And sometimes, love begins beyond the screen. The bell over the little indie cafe in Westbridge chimed like a small apology every time the door opened. Rain had been threaded through the morning, a steady, honest drizzle that left the sidewalks slick and the town smelling faintly of wet stone and roasted beans. Inside, the place smelled warmer: cardamom, old books, the citrus tang of floral foam, and the narrow room hummed with a weekday crowd: students with laptops, an elderly man with a crossword, two women sharing notes on a community meeting. At a corner table by the window, Issa Carrington stirred her cappuccino with a wooden stick until the foam sank into a little crater. She had arrived early because she liked to be punctual, because being early was a remnant of how she'd been raised. Her mother clocking shifts at 2 jobs, ironing uniforms by lamplight, teaching Issa that time respected those who respected it. She had checked her phone 3 times and checked it again, feeling the familiar stir of embarrassment that came when a plan slid away from her. The woman who waited on the corner table beside her had been kind enough to lend a smile, to glance toward the door with a little nod. A child across the room had been humming a tune, making it easier to pretend the empty seat was a small shared joke with the town, not a humiliation. When the server brought the bill, it landed on the table with an unassuming, polite clink. Issa's hands did that thing they did when accounts balanced in her head. She counted the coins in her wallet in a rhythm she knew too well. The total sat like an immediate proof. She was short by $4.41. There was a heat along her neck that she couldn't quite cool. To anyone watching, it was a small thing, a missing amount, a simple arithmetic discomfort. To Issa, who had learned to measure dignity in whether she could pay her own way, it felt like a ledger entry against her worth. She had the presence to stand and offer an embarrassed laugh, to say that she would step outside to find an ATM, but all the ATMs in Westbridge charged higher fees than the town was worth. She had the sense to ask the barista to hold the order, to tuck the bill under her elbow, but the cafe had business that didn't pause for personal discomfort. A man at the counter glanced, offered a sympathetic look, then turned back to his laptop. The woman next to her buried her face in a paperback. The town kept its polite indifference when it came to small, sharp embarrassments. The embarrassment stacked into something heavier. Issa pushed a strand of hair behind her ear and felt the heat of wanting to disappear. She could feel, in the way the other patrons relaxed their attention back into their own days, the pressure of being unremarkable in a way that mattered, not simply invisible, but instructively so. She had learned to carry invisible loads without complaint. But this was a public ledger. The unpaid cup, the quick calculations, the tight elbows. She felt the town watching as tally. A hand settled on the table before she could make the joke that would hide the sting. The cappuccino that had been blurred to a small, lukewarm island now had a second cup beside it. The hand belonged to a man who smelled faintly of rain and something cedar, an unpretentious scent that didn't try to announce success. He wore a raincoat the color of deep coffee and his hair was still damp. When he smiled, only with the hint of a smile, not a show, it was not one of pity. "Sorry about the wait," he said, and the voice surprised her by not filling the room. It fit the space like a paragraph that knew exactly how long it needed to be. "On me." She opened her mouth, a reflexive thank you ready, then closed it. Gratitude felt messy. She both wanted to accept and to refuse the speed at which charity folded into the space between them. She slid her hand across the table, laying down the coins she did have, an instinctive counterweight. He made a small, precise shake of his head, removed a folded piece of paper from his pocket, and put it next to her cup. There was nothing theatrical about the way he'd placed it. No fanfare, no flourish. The paper was a cheap notebook page, folded twice. When she opened it, the inside felt like a pocket of sunlight. Clear handwriting, a single sentence, careful and human in its slant. "There's nothing wrong with showing up, even when no one else does." The sentence hit her like first light through a narrow window. It didn't rearrange her life. It didn't pay rent or make a job appear. It slid along the place inside her that kept lists of small failures and smoothed them out for a moment. To be seen like that, seen not as a calculation but as a witnessable fact, was not the same as being fixed, but it opened a space where she could breathe. "Thank you," she said at last, because gratitude had to have words. He nodded and gave her the kind of small, honest smile that suggested he understood gratitude as something shared, not assigned. They exchanged names, briefly, like bookmarks, and then the man left as quietly as he'd come, the bell over the cafe apologizing in the rain. She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, as if to carry the sentence with her like an amulet. The handwriting was not signed. The man had not offered a card, an explanation, a request to stay in touch. He had left the sentence where she would be able to return to it in the quiet stings of her days. A deliberate, non-performative kindness in a town where showing up was sometimes the only proof of a life. For days after, the note resided in the inside front pocket of her coat. Whenever her shift at the bookstore took up her hands in the morning, whenever she snipped stems at the flower shop in the afternoon, she would find her fingers worrying the fold, and the sentence would settle the part of her that feared small humiliations. Westbridge hadn't changed. The bus routes, the narrow sidewalks, the patch of paint flaking off the town bench were as they had been, but the little sentence angled toward her life, the way a thin beam of light will redirect dust when a window opens. Issa worked in the afternoons at a flower shop on the town square, and in the mornings at a cramped second-hand bookstore that smelled of dust and lemon polish. Both jobs were patchwork, wages stitched between tips and the occasional weekend market. In the bookstore, she would reshelve novels with a care that bordered on reverence. Someone had loved these pages before they were here. And she would recommend books without ceremony, choosing stories for readers who might need a quiet companion more than a plot. At the flower shop, she learned the soft grammar of bouquets, how to balance a stem of eucalyptus against an emphatic spray of bright ranunculus, how to wrap stems in brown paper so the gesture itself looked like intention. Issa's hands were deft from years of work that required both gentleness and speed. She had a practical mind. She could figure out profit margins for the shop's small Saturday pop-up, and she could also soothe an elderly customer whose memory had lost the date of her wedding anniversary. People in Westbridge came to rely on small certainties. Issa's recommendation for the best local soup, the bookstore's single lounger by the window, the florist who could make a funeral arrangement look like honor rather than burden. Her life was a series of reliable moments, stitched together in an order that made sense for those who were always 10 minutes late. Those were the scenes where she let the note inside her pocket unfold into action, rather than simply a private balm. When a boy selling cookies outside of the student centre tripped and lost a stack of wrapped treats, Issa helped him gather them with a smile and cunning fingers. She tucked a little cash into his palm when he thanked her. She told him he had good packaging, work on his sign, and that people liked a story with their cookies. When an elderly woman came by the shop with a prescription, but not the coins to cover the delivery fee for flowers to her son in the care centre, Issa paid it without making a show of it. It was not heroic. It was, in her mind, what showing up looked like. To step into the tiny breach where someone needed help, and to do so without fanfare. Westbridge noticed small things like that. The town tucked them into its ledger the way it paid attention to holiday decorations and lawn ornaments, quiet, practical observations. It did not often rearrange systems for them. But the trickle of kindness seeded a different order, a network of people who kept an eye on each other. When Issa closed up the flower shop at dusk, the florist's old dog would follow her to the bakery window and wait stoically while she peered at the reflection of street lamps on puddles. These domestic rituals modestly suggested a life worth holding together. Meanwhile, in a set of offices a few miles upriver from the square, Caleb Montgomery ran a company that made a mental health app people used in the pockets of their days. Its interface was a blue that suggested calm. Its onboarding sequence promised incremental check-ins that were supposed to derail spirals before they grew. Investors liked the metrics, the team liked the language of impact. Caleb liked the idea of fixing what had once almost bent him in two. He had built the company out of the scattered pieces of his own sleeplessness, a string of late-night journalings, a few misfired prototypes, a conversation or two that had landed in the right place by accident. It had become successful in a way that taught him how small-scale changed into something that required constant tending. The work was exactly the sort of thing that burned people out, the pressure to scale, the imperative to measure every human response and translate it into graphs and quarterly reports. Caleb moved through it with the tight shoulders of someone perpetually on watch. He sometimes visited the little indie cafe in Westbridge because it felt like a place that hadn't yet produced messaging for its emotion. It was not gilded or polished. It was functional and honest, and its clientele were the kind of people who asked for a little extra almond milk without being performative about it. He watched without announcing himself because watching someone quietly is often the closest thing to listening you can offer. He noticed Issa first because she wore competence like a quiet uniform. She had good posture when she carried a stack of books. She had a way of turning a bouquet so the stems aligned like a small miracle. She laughed easily, without pulling her smile into a shape to please others. He watched her tip a hat to an old man, saw the careful, gentle attention with which she set a wrapped flower into a paper bag. He liked watching people whose presence felt uncalibrated to impress. There were nights when Caleb stayed at the office until 2 or 3 in the morning, the team's whiteboards crowded with half-formed hypotheses and sticky notes like bursts of colour. He had a pulse of needing to solve everything at once: the growth curve, the user retention, the philanthropic narratives that made charts look human. That urgency kept him awake. He drank too much coffee and then switched to tea. He had learned to stare at numbers until they rearranged themselves into comforting patterns, which was not always good for anyone's sense of rest. His kindness at the cafe that morning, paying for the cup, leaving the small note, was not an attempt at grandeur. He did not view the town as a problem to be solved. In truth, the note came from a line he had written often to himself on nights when his own will wavered, a reminder that presence mattered more than perfection. He did not imagine it becoming a cartridge of fate in another person's life. He had not meant to change the course of anything. He meant to leave something short and human in the world, an alignment, a small corrective for his own loneliness. A brief pause in the story. Be honest. Have you ever met someone online who changed your life? Tell your story in the comments. Back to the story. In the days after the note, their encounters were the gentlest kind of coincidence. He would be at the counter and she would be shelving a return she'd bought for a customer. He would offer a comment about a podcast and Issa would respond by recommending a book. Their conversations were not scripted. They gathered around mundane things: favourite pastry, the right time to start tomatoes indoors, that the bookstore downstairs occasionally hosted readings that made the cafe feel like a neighbour. He began, unself-consciously, to tell her about prototypes when he needed to untangle a problem into plain speech. She would listen and then hand him something practical, an observation about language, a note on the emotional tone of an onboarding prompt. The suggestions were often small but necessary. Add an option for a brief, simple pause, she said one afternoon. Not a whole module, just a blinking check-in that guarantees someone sees you in the moment. He tried it in an A/B test. The retention curve improved slightly. It was not career-changing, but it was a thing that shifted the way the product met its users. Issa never asked for anything in return. She took her shifts, she kept her hands working, she made tea for herself in the same unassuming way that defined both her patience and her practicality. The more Caleb watched, the less he felt like a CEO, and the more he felt like a person who had been given a map, the legend of which told him that the town and its narrow acts of care mattered for their own sake. On a Rain Street Tuesday, after a long meeting about user drop-off statistics, Caleb invited Issa to sit in on a casual product review. They were not yet offering salaries to outside consultants, but they had a spare chair and a small hope that a fresh set of eyes might help. He thought of the way she arranged flowers and shelved books and imagined the attentiveness translating into a perspective the office hadn't considered. She agreed with the same practical curiosity she brought to everything. She arrived in jeans and a raincoat with a scarf knotted in a way that suggested she had more urgent things to do than make a statement. The product team looked surprised at first, an unexpected participant in their rituals. Issa sat quietly and listened as the team scrolled through metrics, spoke in acronyms, and showed clips of the onboarding flow. When it was her turn to speak, she did not offer a long speech. She offered a single, precise suggestion. Let users acknowledge something small each morning. Not a task list. A single sentence that says, I am here for this moment. Make it optional, make it affirming. Not therapy, just a human nudge. There is a particular kind of authority that comes from someone who knows the day-to-day edges of ordinary life. She used concrete language, examples from the bookstore customers, small moments she'd noticed in the cafe. The team, used to the language of venture-backed priorities, found her perspective oddly grounding. They tested the feature in the next sprint and labeled it Morning Pause in the roadmap, a tongue-in-cheek reminder that not all growth is aggressive. The partnership that began to form between them was not dramatic. It was a curve that bent toward collaboration because each offered the other something. Caleb, an access to structure and reach. Issa, a living knowledge of human friction, of what made an app feel like something to hold on to rather than an instruction manual. She did not want the corporate world as an escape. She wanted a platform that would respect the dignity of the people it served. Caleb did not see her work as charity. He saw it as necessary and, in a way that surprised him, as a mirror. Outside the office windows, Westbridge went about its rhythm. A delivery truck idled. A teenager with a skateboard navigated around a puddle. A woman on the balcony above the cafe watered a plant that refused to bloom. Inside, the product team kept its whiteboards and sticky notes. The conversations were real, about empathy design and a clearer path through late-night panic triggers. They discussed language choices and the ethics of nudges. Issa's modesty meant she rarely took credit for the suggestions that landed in product tickets. She sat back while the team debated and coded. But when users wrote in, short messages that said, I used the morning prompt today and it stopped me from spiraling, the team would tag the message and smile at each other, the glow of real-world feedback easing the habitual corporate strain. That glow made the idea of inviting Issa in for a longer-term consulting role feel less like a favor and more like a practical necessity. Caleb, for his part, did not make the offer lightly. He wrote an email that tried to balance being professional with being honest, and even in that he struggled because he wanted to avoid implying she needed him to be credible. He wanted to make clear that he valued the work she already did. The email said, simply, we would be honored if you'd consult. You'd be paid. Your schedule is respected. If you're interested, let's talk. Issa read the message at the bus stop, the rain forming tiny glass beads on the bench. She had to force herself to breathe in the ordinary air of Westbridge and not let her mind leap to the complicated ledger of what accepting might mean. She had faintly a social appetite for privacy. The town's orbit of people intersected, and the office was a different world. A consulting role had obvious benefits, steady pay for expertise she already used daily, but it also meant stepping into a place where things were measured in charts and press releases, where the word scalability felt like a threat to the quiet dignity she cultivated. She called her mother before answering. Her mother, on the other end of the line, listened without surprise. You always make things better by taking them apart and putting them back together, she said, the kind of practical ministry only a parent could offer. If someone is asking for that, you could charge for it, and if it helps, if it gives you time, take it. The CTA came then, a moment in the story where the world outside the page wanted a small exchange. If this story resonates, stay with it. There are more of these small turns ahead, the voice seemed to say. It was an invitation to keep watching small human choices unfold into larger design. The life of the town, like a mosaic, is best seen in a long look. Those words, gentle, optional, unobtrusive, helped smooth the froth of the day. Issa said yes, first to herself and then to Caleb, but not without caveats. I don't want to be token, she said, in a meeting where the product lead spoke enthusiastically about potential press angles. I'm not here for optics. I want to help you make something people can actually use." The team took that as a professional boundary. They liked her demand for practical language. It kept the conversation anchored. Her work at the company began in small steps. She came in twice a week at first. She sat in on user research calls and sometimes observed silently, taking notes in an old composition notebook. She and Caleb ate pizza together on the roof when deadlines made dinners awkward, and they talked about the small things: a film he'd seen, an old song she'd loved, a childhood memory of cleaning windows at her mother's motel so the guests would think it sparkled. Those rooftop lunches were not cinematic gestures. They were a place where two people traded ordinary comforts. There were other, more intimate moments that built mutual reliance. On a night when a product deadline loomed and Caleb's breathing became a tight, lurching thing, Issa noticed and stepped close without drama. She did not ask a to-do list of him. She sat across from him in the dimness and said, "Breathe with me." He laughed with the unnecessary surprise of someone who had believed coping was a private domain. He drew a breath in time with hers, and the office let him regain a rhythm that did not sound like a broken record. He did not, in those early days, see himself as being saved. That language would have felt alien to both of them. What he saw was a habit forming. He started to notice when he was wearing exhaustion and learned to remove it with small practices. He began to place a short message in the morning check-in of the app, largely because Issa had recommended it, and it reminded him, in the small personal way that technology sometimes can, that the world contained gaps worth tending. Their affection grew in the spaces between decisions. A text sent at midnight asking if he'd remembered to eat, a coffee left at a counter with a sticky note that said simply, "For when you forget." It was a romance whose gravity came from reciprocity rather than rescue. Each did not negate the other's competence. Instead, they amplified it. Issa's voice began to be heard in product meetings with a clarity that earned respect. Caleb began to show up to the cafe not to be seen, but because he genuinely wanted to be near the ordinary. Even as their closeness grew, there were small edges of caution. The world beyond their immediate circle liked narratives it could compress, the kind where a bright-haired outsider enters a high-powered life, and, like a domino chain, everything rearranges. The kind where a CEO performs redemption with grandiose gestures. But their relationship was stubbornly resistant to simple narratives. Issa negotiated her presence at the company with a quiet insistence on being credited for her work. When her idea improved retention by a measurable amount, she didn't stand at the center of a press conference. She asked that the team include her name in the release and that an acknowledgement be posted in the internal newsletter. Those small demands were important. They were public traces of agency that kept the professional stakes clear. She did not want to be perceived as an accessory to success. She wanted the company, the product, to be better because she had been heard. Caleb respected that. It was one of the reasons he had been drawn to her from the beginning. The town of Westbridge watched in its way. People noticed that Issa spent a little less time in the afternoon at the flower shop and a few more afternoons in a glass meeting room. They commented in passing, but did not make assumptions. Westbridge's gossip was practical and domestic. It did not have the ferocity of a media market that turned private facts into public weather. Still, small conversations started at the cafe counter. A woman who ran the diner told the florist's owner that she had seen Issa at a meeting and thought it a good thing. An intern at the app posted a picture of a rooftop lunch on an anonymized feed, and the town's rumor mill registered it with an idle curiosity. None of this suggested scandal. For now, the arc was simply that someone had paid for a cappuccino and left a line on a piece of paper, and that line had multiplied into possibilities neither of them had asked for, but both began to shape. The work continued. Product tickets, book recommendations, bouquets folded as if they were letters. Patterns emerged. A user sent a note thanking the team for the morning pause. A customer in the bookstore recommended a memoir that Issa had chosen. Small confirmations that the world, in fact, responded when tended. The story could have settled there in the steady accrual of small changes. But inside meetings, Language about metrics and press tests hovered like a second humidity. Investors sometimes asked for faster growth. The team sometimes used words like narrative and positioning in ways that flattened the gentle edges of what they cared about. The presence of a new voice, Isa's voice, was both clarifying and unsettling to those who preferred the old metric-driven model. This tension would require navigation in a way that neither of them could fully anticipate. One evening, Isaac, Caleb, asked Isa to come to an office gathering where a few local benefactors and some members of the product team would meet informally. He framed it as a small thank you for her work so far, a chance to introduce her to the people who had been writing checks and asking questions. She agreed, but later, standing in front of her small mirror, smoothed the collar of a shirt that felt neither like a costume nor completely like home. "You're not a charity," she told herself. She wasn't. She was an equal participant in something that needed housekeepers as much as visionaries. They arrived at the event in different modes of self-presentation. Caleb, with the careful, practiced neutral of someone used to being looked at. Isa, with a practical air that made her look like she belonged anywhere. At the reception, a well-dressed woman made a comment, too casual, too vaguely impressed, that carried the briefest undertone of surprise at Isa's presence there. It was the kind of remark that could be brushed away. Isa brushed it away with ease and a light laugh that turned it into a matter-of-fact conversation about work-life balance. She moved through the room as if she had always belonged, and for the moment, she did. By the time the evening wound down, talking had stretched into a subtle form of acceptance. Caleb and Isa walked out onto the street together, their umbrella a small island against the drizzle. They passed the little indie cafe and saw its warm light spill into the wet night, a small visual echo of the earlier note. They paused there, and Caleb reached for her hand, not in a dramatic proposal of future or past, but as a mutual reassurance, the gesture of two people who had chosen to stand next to each other. "Thank you," he said, meaning the work, the presence, the small insistences that had taught him how to breathe a little more slowly. She looked at him, and then at the cafe, and smiled with the unperformed warmth that had captured his attention in the first place. "You left a line on a napkin," she said, teasing, "and I stole it." He asked if she'd consider a longer commitment, consulting 3 days a week, paid, with the opportunity to make suggestions that would be formally integrated into future updates. "We can be practical about this," he said. "You don't have to move in. We can respect the things you already care about." She did not say yes immediately. She weighed the offer like a ledger, considering the work, the potential for increased income, the unavoidable visibility. She also thought of her own life, her mother's routines, the bookstore's schedule, the flower shop's Saturday rush. She was not a woman who accepted change for the sake of novelty. She accepted it when it fit the curve of what she already believed in. "Let me think about it," she said, and he understood it for what it was. Not a refusal, but a careful step. When she walked home that night, the streets of Westbridge had the midnight hush of a town that kept its eyes half shut. The little indie cafe's sign glowed like a punctuation mark. She pulled the note from her pocket and read the sentence again. It was the same line she had folded from the first time, plain, honest, unembellished. There was, she thought, an economy in that kind of kindness. It did not demand immediate transformation. It offered a small reorientation. She slept with the idea of the job open in her mind, not in a way that consumed her, but in the way a question sometimes settles into a kitchen window, quiet, reflective. The next day at the flower shop, she measured stems with a steady hand, and when a woman came in, whose husband had just been discharged from the hospital, Isa tied the arrangement in a way that allowed for a note to be tucked inside without crumpling. She did not assume that the arrangement would change the world. She assumed it would make one day in a life less heavy. And there is, in that work, a certain gravity. Caleb sent a message. No pressure, but if she wanted, they'd draft something formal in a week. Isa replied with pragmatic times she could make. In those small exchanges, they built a scaffolding that honored both the town's rhythms and the office's needs. The decision to accept, when it came, was not a fireworks display. It was a quiet choice made on the other side of an ordinary afternoon. A combination of a good night's sleep, a phone call with her mother that ended with them laughing at an old story, and a moment where she realized that the work in the office might allow her to shape tools that people used during small crises in their pockets. She wrote her acceptance in an email with a subject line that said simply, "Yes, count me in." The team celebrated in modest fashion. A pizza on the rooftop, a small cake that read, "Welcome." People clapped. The product lead pretended to be offended at the notion that Issa had not yet become an official part of the roster. And Caleb gave a little speech that was admirably short and honest. He spoke about listening and about how the product had improved when it embraced small human truths. He did not make promises about changing the world that he could not keep. He said instead that their work could make someone's day a little less heavy. It seemed in that moment like an honest metric. Issa was careful in these early days to remain present in the town that had formed her habits. She continued to keep the flower shop's Saturday shift and the bookstore's early mornings, not out of a desire to appear virtuous, but because the routines were integral to the person she was. The team respected that. They structured meetings so she could keep her hands in paper and stems. There were tender scenes in the days that followed. Caleb bringing a thermos of tea to the flower shop because he'd learned, through a profile conversation, that she liked a certain steeped blend at mid-afternoon. Issa leaving a note on his desk with a book recommendation. Both of them coming to the little indie cafe sometimes just to be part of the town's incidental music. They were not theatrical love scenes. They were the small accumulations of taste and time that, when collected, made the shape of a life together. If there was any foreshadowing in these days, it was the knowledge that the world beyond Westbridge operated in louder registers. Investors were people who read headlines. Reporters were people who liked crisp narratives. And corporate boards were people who asked for certainty in exchange for capital. Issa had come in to make a product better for human beings. She did not want, and did not expect, for her life to become the subject of anyone's narrative beyond the small circles of people whose names she knew. Yet the small edges where personal and public mix are always overlapping like two colours on a piece of wet paper. For now, the colour bled gently. The rest, how the world would interpret the pattern, and whether those interpretations would leave scars, had not yet arrived. But the choice she had made to bring her presence into a broader field opened new possibilities and new forms of exposure. It was a deliberate risk, measured and careful. One evening, after a long day of rearranging petals and checking user feedback, Issa walked past the little indie cafe and saw, in the rain-smeared window, a reflection that put her within the frame of both the town and the larger world she had begun to enter. She thought of the folded note crumpled now into the lining of her coat and felt a small, steady pulse of gratitude. The line had been the hinge. It had not given her a life. It had invited her to notice one. It was a sentence she carried without assuming it would be enough. The town, the office, and her own stubborn dignity would have to do the rest. As she turned the corner toward home, the bell over the cafe chimed again, and inside, in the soft light, someone had left a single cup sitting where life and possibility touched. The future, in that moment, was simply a continuation of small things. The next shift, a new feature in a product roadmap, a rooftop lunch, a bouquet tied with brown paper that smelled faintly of citrus and hope. She kept walking, the rain making the pavement shine, feeling for once like showing up might be enough. If only because showing up was where the work began. The next weeks unfolded like the turning of a season. At first, patient and steady, then edged with a tension Issa had learned to read in the half-tones of people's voices. The feature she'd suggested, Morning Pause, rolled out in a soft launch. A few thousand users clicked it on the first morning, then tens of thousands. The team celebrated with small paper cups of coffee and a whiteboard scrawled with metrics that read like modest victories. Issa took no bows. She kept her composition notebook and her careful, ready hands. She found refuge in the rhythm of the flower shop and the bookstore. She kept showing up. It had been a week of pleasant, ordinary feedback when the first image threaded through their channels. An offhand rooftop photograph posted by someone on the product team. It was a candid Caleb and Isa laughing over a pizza box, the city light flattened into an orange smear behind them. The caption hinted at an inner joke. It was meant to be small, a team memento. In less than an afternoon, the image migrated. An anonymous feed repurposed it with a speculative line about office romances. And the implication shaped itself like a headline. The town gossip in Westbridge started as a slow simmer. At the little indie cafe, people tucked the rumour into the same drawer as their opinions on the new bakery across the square. Outside the office, however, the image aggregated into something louder. A crusty local blog picked it up, and with that combination of appetite and inexactness that journalism sometimes fed on, layered a headline about impropriety with an angle about favouritism. The piece did not invent anything salacious. It only asked the question in a way that demanded easier answers than the truth afforded. From that morning on, the company inbox behaved like an animal that had found a scent. Investors pinged. A PR agency sent a draft that spoke in antiseptic phrases. "We must manage perceptions," it said. The board scheduled a call. The product team's chat threaded into a tangle, and notifications multiplied into a noise that made it harder to hear the steady work underneath. Isa watched it all like someone standing beside a road as traffic rerouted itself. She checked the releases and read what had been written about her like someone reading a stranger's account. The initial piece had been careful enough, but the cadence of comment sections and quoted speculation sharpened the edges. An editor's paragraph implied that the public might view her input as influenced by personal relations. Where her name had been attached to internal notes, press copy now circled around Caleb's title, the company's momentum, the features that were shaped by leadership. Credit, which in their internal newsletter had been recorded in clean bullet points, evaporated under the prying vocabulary of outside narratives. At the office, those outside narratives began to echo. The product lead, someone who had been practical and supportive, walked a tight line between loyalty to a teammate and the obligations of fiduciary concern. "This is about optics," he said in a meeting that smelled of stale coffee and scanner paper. "We can't have the product perceived as dependent on relationships. Investors—" He did not finish. He didn't need to. The implication lodged in the room. A legal advisor, careful and detached, suggested an internal review and a communications strategy that would put distance between the company's personal and professional faces. Isa felt the room tilt under her, not dramatically, but with the slow dislodging of a familiar table. She asked quietly that her contributions be acknowledged in the upcoming press release. She asked that the internal newsletter include her notes alongside the feature credit. The group made gestures of assent that were thin. A mention of editorial adjustments landed in her inbox instead. Her name had been placed lower in the credits, an editor's choice that cut across what had actually occurred in product meetings. It felt small and sharp at once, like a pebble that lodged a shoe. She confronted the product lead with her notebook open, the small squares of paper showing dates and phrases and user quotes. He looked at each entry and then at her, and there was a flash of the uncomfortable truth. The company, pressed by money and narratives, would sometimes smooth its edges in the direction of safety. "We are doing risk management," he said. "It's temporary. We're protecting the launch." Isa packed a box that night. Her composition notebooks, a potted succulent she had kept at her desk, a small tin where she'd saved a few sticky notes of user thanks. She left without drama. She told no one she was going. She wanted no complaint or spectacle. She wanted, instead, to preserve the dignity of the work she had done and to avoid being turned into a symbol someone else would auction off. Outside, Westbridge breathed the same air it always had. The smell of rain and roasted beans, the intermittent ring of the bell at the cafe. But for Isa, that familiar air felt like a filter that had shifted colour. At home, she sat at the small kitchen table and spread the pages from her notebook. In the margins, she had written user quotes. Someone who had used the morning pause and not started down a spiral that night. Another who had found the option to message a peer as a small lifeline. Those words still mattered. Those hands had still touched them. But public credit had a way of staking claim to someone's labor, and she was not inclined to have her work recast into a moral spectacle. She told Caleb she was leaving the company in a short email. He called immediately, and then came over in person, stopping by the shop to find her arranging stems with the same careful competitiveness she used on a Saturday rush. He found her with a stack of brown paper and a look of sad composure. "Isa," he said, and the name felt like a bell. "I can't be made into the story so someone else can feel safer," she said. The words were not a rebuke as much as a boundary. "It's not about me. It's about how people are written in other people's accounts." He listened, and then he tried to argue for reparations, internal credits, an apology, a public clarification. But the board's conversations had already begun to carve outcomes into stone. There were, he told her, investors calling for distance and for clarity. He had fought in boardrooms in the afternoon with the tired shape of someone trying to convert conviction into a spreadsheet. He had made a plea to put accurate credits in the release. He had been told it could increase churn with certain stakeholders. He could imagine why companies, like towns, had latitudes they would not cross. He apologized for the slow machinery he had not yet learned to stop. "I'm not asking you to fix it," Isa said. "I'm asking you to not let me be used as a placeholder." He did not want to be the reason she left. He did not want his choices to result in someone else's retreat. In the end, he sat in his car outside the florist and watched the rain bead on the windshield the way someone watches a city pass. He took the train back to the office and, in a quiet move that surprised even him, he refused to sign a version of the press release that removed all mention of Isa's name from the feature credits. The legal team called the move risky. The board called it complicated. The PR agency said it could be handled differently. He chose to stand in the small, awkward middle of the argument. He would not write her out. That public act was not, in itself, a cure. It opened a fissure with investors who equated distance with stability. Some funds began to make noises about reallocating. The board convened more frequently. The company phone lines filled with messages that required triage. Newsfeeds are less forgiving than a single man in a room. They demand resolution and reward stories that are simple. But Caleb did something else too. In an internal memo, he demanded that every credit that attached to a product feature be traceable and transparent. He asked the team to publish a names and contributions section in their release process. It was administrative, painfully bureaucratic, and yet useful. It was not a heroic gesture so much as a procedural one, an attempt to immunize the work from interpretive extraction. Still, the noise persisted. It affected Isa personally. She read messages and comments that misread her presence as opportunism, that implied tokens. She found a small but bitter post on a local page implying she had used her access. The speculation clotted into a pressure that left her feeling exposed in a way she had avoided all her life. The day she left town, a thin fog sat over Westbridge, and the square looked continentally grey. She packed a thrifted duffel for the weekend she told herself she needed. She closed the flower shop door with the same ritual motion she'd always used. A hand on the knob, a breath, the audible click of the latch. The florist's old dog nosed her leg and she stooped to scratch him. "I'll be back," she told him, in truth, not knowing whether that was an assumption of return or a hope. Her mother listened on the other end of the line as Isa explained the leaving. "You did the work you could do," her mother said, in the economy of speech only a mother learns. "You are not what other people say about you. You are what you do." Isa took the train to the edge of town and wandered without a plan. She found the student with the cookies, who now had a small table of his own outside a lecture hall. He greeted her like a friend and offered a bag of imperfect shards for free. She gave him a list of vendors who might take his cookies and the number of a supplier with better packaging. She met the elderly woman whose son had appreciated the floral delivery, and they sat for a moment on a bench while the woman played a hymn on an old phone app. Those small scenes stitched a different narrative than the one the internet amplified. A direct ledger of impact rather than rumor. Back in the city that housed the company's offices, Caleb felt the change as a chisel might feel the grain of wood. He saw that systems mattered, the way contributions were recorded, the way credit was distributed, and he also felt a personal ache. His first instinct was to correct the public record in a way that would be neat and decisive. His second was to find Issa in the life she'd returned to and say, plainly, that he had chosen the inconvenient work of truth over the easier goods of a papered-over calm. He went to her small apartment one evening with his raincoat dark and his hair flat from the drizzle. He found her at the kitchen table, notebook open, the pages covered in tidy handwriting. She looked up, and the room contained, as it often did, something domestic and unadorned. A mug with a chip on the rim, a string of postcards tacked to a cork. He sat across from her and did not begin with big statements. He told her about the meeting he'd had, the board, the investors, the PR drafts. He told her he had refused to sign away her name. "Why didn't you fight harder earlier?" she asked, without heat, more puzzled than accusatory. "Because sometimes I thought the easier choice of making everything anonymous would protect you," he said. "I didn't know it would make you invisible." It was raining again outside, the sound like a blanket stitched across the windows. He took off his coat and folded it over the back of a chair. He tried, in that small domestic light, to explain the pressure of being the person responsible for a company, how responsibilities look like measurement and how measurement can erase edges. He did not romanticize his struggle. He only laid it out. Numbers, conversations, the way fear can make people ask for certainty at the cost of people. Issa listened, and then, as she often did, reached for the concrete. "What will you do now?" she asked. He had thought of many things in the quiet weeks since she left: resigning, restructuring, hiring an independent ethics officer, ideas that sounded good in a boardroom, and less so when they required other people to carry the consequence. What he did choose, finally, was public and small, an op-ed that he wrote for a thoughtful outlet, not sensational, that did not ask for pity, but that insisted on clarity. He wrote about the way teams are made, the small hands that shape product, the necessity of transparent crediting. He named the morning pause, and the team, and the people who had been involved. He wrote Issa's name, and he wrote that her contributions had been part of the product's design. He spoke about culture and the responsibility of leaders to protect the dignity of those they worked with. The piece did not erase the rumor or the noise, but it changed the conversation. It made it harder for others to reduce Issa to a rumor. It also, perhaps more importantly, signaled the tone with which Caleb intended to manage his leadership. For him, it was both a professional decision and a personal one. He would not allow the company's account to be a place for another person to be flattened. Issa read the op-ed alone, at a diner counter. She folded the paper, smoothed it flat with a hand that had learned how to arrange petals, and considered that the line he'd written about showing up had been folded back into his rhetoric of action. The gesture mattered because it was not showy. It was an insistence. She did not rush back to the office. She needed time for decisions not to be hurried into her bones by other people's calendars. They reconciled, in the small way their story had always done, through presence rather than proclamation. He walked to the flower shop the next afternoon and watched as she tied a bouquet for a mother leaving town. He did not make a scene. He waited until the moment had no audience, and then he knocked on the glass. She looked up, surprised, and then allowed him to come inside. He had in his hand a piece of paper, nothing more than the folded line he'd left months earlier, the same handwriting, the same slant. "I remember why I wrote it," he said. "I remember why seeing someone mattered to me. I want to see you, not because I think you rescue me, but because I want to be present to someone whose work I value." She smiled, not because everything had been healed, but because his sentence had returned not as a debt, but as a mirror. "You never asked for credit either," she said. "You didn't need it the way people did." They walked in the rain without umbrellas, the water making small crowns where it hit puddles. There was a spot under a lamppost where they stopped and spoke, not in grand declarations, but in practical, necessary honesty. Caleb insisted that the company publish a clear record of contributions in their public documentation. Issa insisted that any public narrative acknowledge how public stories can injure and that there be recourse for anyone so affected. They made plans for structural changes, a named acknowledgement section, an independent advisory board for ethics and credit, a funded fellowship for unpaid contributors who came from outside the industry, concrete measures that began to translate ethics into process. She did not return to the company immediately. Instead, they both decided to step off the frantic wheel and consider what the next sustainable arrangement might be. The time apart allowed Issa to imagine a different project entirely, one that took the small kindness of the folded note as an organizing principle. She began to draft a plan for a non-profit, a place that offered short, practical mental health supports in community settings, free check-ins in cafes, peer support training, and partnership with campus counselors. She called it Second Cup, the name a nod to the coffee that had birthed the sentence that changed her life, and a promise that the second cup would be one offered in company, not in isolation. The work of building Second Cup was slow and local. Issa recruited volunteers from the bookstore reading group and from the flower shop staff. She partnered with a campus counselor who donated a room for evening sessions and with a retired nurse who offered training in listening skills. Caleb helped in the ways he knew how. He offered seed funding, but insisted it be structured as a grant rather than a donation, with transparency and governance, so the non-profit would not be perceived as a side project of his company. He did not lead the non-profit. He provided resources and sometimes coffee. He sat in the back of a community meeting and listened without taking the floor. Second Cup's model was modest: short check-ins in local eateries, an app-based callback for non-crisis support that mirrored the morning pause's simplicity, and a peer training program. They set up drop-in hours at the Little Indie Cafe in Westbridge, which became a hub, a small table with a discreet sign, and a volunteer with a badge who could help someone phone a counselor or find a campus resource. It was intentionally low-tech, anchored in human presence more than algorithms. The town responded in pieces. A local teacher brought a group of students for a session before exams. An elderly man came in and told a volunteer that speaking to someone had helped him go to a physical therapy session he'd been avoiding. The cookie boy, now a young man with a better sign and better packaging, volunteered on Saturday mornings to hand out flyers. Those small successes accumulated in a ledger that had no ticker symbol, but that read, in testimonials and returned emails, like modest change. The non-profit's first formal fundraising dinner was scheduled exactly 1 year from the morning Issa had been stood up at the Little Indie Cafe. They chose the event not as a spectacle, but as a recognition of the town and the network that had made the pilot possible. They invited people who had a direct connection to the work: the nurse who had trained the first volunteers, the campus counselor who had opened her office at night, a student who had used the morning pause and then engaged with Second Cup to find a counselor. The guest list was personal. The program was lean. On the night of the gala, the Little Indie Cafe's back room had been transformed into a modest banquet space. Long tables carried mismatched vases full of wildflowers, all tied in brown paper. The lighting was warm and forgiving. The food came from the diner across the square, where the owner had offered to cater at cost. Whatever small wealth they raised would go directly into stipends for peer counselors and into a fund for bus passes for people who needed in-person services. Issa rehearsed her speech behind the scenes like someone preparing a seed to plant, precise and practical. She did not want to make a sermon of the story. She wanted to acknowledge the architecture of help. She thought of the folded note and of the arc that followed. A cappuccino unpaid. A sentence left like a compass. She thought of her mother's hands folding linen, pressing corners into order. She thought of all the small hands that had built a non-profit without expectation of spectacle. When she stood to speak, the room listened the way Westbridge had always listened, attentively and kindly. She spoke about Second Cup's modest aims. We want to lower the cost of being human in that particular awkward hour when things begin to fall apart, she said. She thanked volunteers and donors and did not dramatize the scandal that had preceded the organization. Instead, she named the town and the cafe and the sentence that had anchored her. At the front table, Caleb sat without making a show of ownership, watching like someone who had learned to measure his role in a life differently. There were testimonials interspersed between courses. A student read a note about the morning pause saving a night. The cookie boy told a short, wry story about packaging and how a little help can turn a street table into a business. The